interest groups on American representation. Interest groups in the US provide voters with opportunities for representation and participation, especially between election cycles. However, there may be a fundamental clash between what the members of a pressure group desire and the wider interests of society. Worryingly, some interest groups, such as the pro-gun NRA, have become a warping influence on American democracy, with the power to significantly shape policy. I will focus on the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. With an annual budget of $67 million and over 100,000 members, it is described by the New York Times as the most important organisation affecting America's relationship with Israel. Its annual policy conferences are attended by some 2/3 of Congress, along with past and current members of the executive. There is no doubting its influence, but what does AIPAC stand for? A strident supporter of Israel's foreign policy, AIPAC is widely viewed as a coalition of pro-Israeli, anti-Iran conservatives. Whilst it is easy to lapse into one-sided criticism of the $3 billion in US military aid to Israel, there is genuine cause for concern. Continued conflict in the Israeli-occupied West Bank has attracted great international criticism. Amnesty International reports that 22 Palestinians were killed by Israeli military in 2013, whilst the United Nations Human Rights Council has issued 5 fact-finding missions in the region. The Israeli government has failed to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention or the Biological Weapons Convention and is believed to have 150 nuclear weapons. AIPAC's support for the 2003 Iraq invasion has been mirrored by its role in the Syria crisis. Last September, 250 lobbyists were dispatched to Capitol Hill, advocating American airstrikes against the Assad regime. Furthermore, AIPAC described the situation as a chance to send a forceful message of resolve to Iran. Being pro-Israeli has become equivalent to being anti-Iran, an attitude that obstructs attempts at diplomatic solutions in the region. AIPAC's policy conference will take place next Tuesday, with a centrepiece speech by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He is expected to criticise Obama's attempts at pursuing a step down the Iranian nuclear programme. Meanwhile, delegates currently lobby for the S-1881 bill. In December, this proposal for tougher sanctions on Iran, along with support for Israeli airstrikes, shot up from having 27 co-sponsors in the Senate to 59. This stalled negotiations with Iran. Former AIPAC official Stephen Rosen is rumoured to have claimed that he would get 70 senators to sign a paper napkin within 24 hours. I do not claim that this pro-Israeli lobby is all-powerful. Syrian airstrikes did not go ahead, whilst Obama has repeatedly threatened to veto harsher sanctions against Iran. That said, AIPAC's role in American politics, fueled by Israeli funding and accompanied by a sense of invincibility, is alarming. There is an inherent disparity between what AIPAC members desire and what is right for America as a whole. Increasingly, there is doubt over whether AIPAC uses its significant influence for the good of the US or the good of Israel. This is a threat to Congress's responsibility to be of the people, by the people, and for the people. It is worth noting that in 2012 elections, 70% of American Jews sided with Obama. AIPAC does not stand for Jewish Americans. Rather, it gives weight to a minority of hardline anti-Iran militarists. Its overarching ability to control debate and influence voting is a continuing threat to representation in the United States. And I'll introduce the next speaker. A great pleasure in introducing Professor Andrew Massey, who will speak on the topic Congress versus Parliament, which is the most effective legislature. Professor Massey currently lectures in politics at Exeter University, specialising in comparative public policy and administration with a special interest in energy policy. Furthermore, he is Editor-in-Chief of the International Review of Administrative Sciences, a forum for the discussion of comparisons between the new approaches in government. In addition, Professor Massey is Vice President of the European Group for Public Administration and Deputy Editor for the journal Public Money and Management. In 2001, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly on the future of public administration in the English-speaking world. Given such a list of accolades, we stand to benefit greatly from this discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Andrew Massey.
congratulations again. I didn't know you got my mother to write the introduction. So I'm going to talk today about Congress or Parliament, which is the most effective legislature. And I should point out that my primary interest isn't American politics per se, it's comparative politics. So I like to look at what different legislatures do, what different administrations do, what different countries do across a range of policies. And so I'm not going to delve into the minute detail of the 71st Congress or the War Powers Act, or how the Watergate babes in 1974 to 76 drew back powers away from the Presidential Congress. Interesting though that is for people like me and other train spotters, it's not very interesting for you. What I'm going to do is a little bit of what Matt did and go back into history and then bring it back up to today to see how we can compare and why we compare the way we do. So, a little bit of the historical background, not too much, but enough for you to understand. What do we mean by effective? When I saw the title I was given, I thought, crikey, what is effective? How can you understand? One of the things you have to do when you get to university is define the terms first. Now, as Kathy said quite rightly, here as A-level students, you're going to be tormented by marking schemes. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is working on a committee which is looking at changing the A-level in government and politics, but I'm afraid there'll still be marking schemes. What you do at university is you go beyond the marking scheme. So we give you the basics, and then we like you to take it a bit further. So what I might mean by effective might be very different to what you might mean by effective. And that's the fun of a topic like this, because you can say effective in doing what? I want to look a little bit at what are the functions of a legislation. Why do we have legislatures? It's not just to make laws. Before I go on, anybody else got an idea, why do we have Congress? Why do we have a Parliament? What does it do? It makes laws, but what else does it do? Yeah. Representation, very important element, goes back to Matt's talk. What else does it do on top of that? What do you see every Wednesday in the British Parliament? Yeah. Exactly. Hold the executive to account. And that is a very key element, and I want to spend a little time on that all the way through today's talk. And then I want to do, just briefly compare them all the way through. What is the role of Congress and the role of Parliament? So the historical background. I didn't realise we both had the same picture of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson actually began life as an English country gentleman, although born in America. His mother was born at Shadwell in London. And if you go to Virginia, Monticello, where he lived for much of his life, just down the road he inherited the farm of his mother, which was named Shadwell, after her early years. George Washington's mother, born in Epping Forest in London. Both men, when they were born and growing into adulthood, were English gentlemen. Had the American Revolution failed, they call it the War of Independence, the British call it the Revolution, had it failed, they'd have been hanged for treason. And that was why it was so important, because what they saw themselves as, yes, they invented the United States of America in many ways, but they saw themselves as the inheritors of an English, and a specifically English tradition of liberty. And that's important. The background to why the Congress and Parliament, and indeed most parliaments in the English-speaking world and the new Commonwealth and the old Commonwealth, are structured the way they are, is because of English common law. Do you know what English common law is? Any idea what is English common law? No, most people don't. I'm not surprised you. People don't go around thinking, I want to think about the English common law today. It's not a law for people who watch Coronation Street and eat chips in front of the TV. It's not common in that sense. What it means is a law that is applied. Somebody there eats chips in front of the TV. I can see you looking guilty over because you're a friend. But what it is a law that applies to everybody. If you go back into history, one of the things that the early Saxons did, and the reason I'm talking about the early Saxons is I haven't gone off onto a history lecture, it actually runs right the way through to where we are today, is that they elected their kings. Now, it wasn't everybody, it wasn't women, it wasn't slaves, it wasn't peasants, it was the earls, it was the barons, it was the leading warriors. because they elected them in a thing called the Witan, because up until that point, if you didn't like the king, you assassinated him, you killed him. And the Saxons evolved a system of very, very early parliamentary democracy. They didn't call it that, but that's essentially what it is. After the Norman conquest and the gradual imposition of feudal law throughout all of the British Isles, what you had was memories of that early democracy. And again, it wasn't called democracy, it was more participatory, but that's what it was. But you also had the king's law, you had the bishop's law, you had the abbot's law, you had the droit de seigneur, the law of the baron in his local baroncy, you had the law in the cities of the major combinations. And what the ordinary people wanted was a common law, a law under which everybody was judged. And that evolved over several hundred years. And the most important of these was the redress of grievance before the granting of supply. In other words, once Parliament was established, it established the principle that before it would give money to the king or the queen, all the grievances, all the things that the ordinary people wanted addressed would be addressed. And that was the basic function of Parliament initially, not to make law, but to hold the king or the emperor to account. The English Civil War, where the English dealt with that very quickly by beheading Charles I, very effective, didn't come back any offend. The point was, you had leading thinkers at that stage. John Locke, Algernon Sidney, William Penn, all friends together. William Penn fell foul of Charles II and went off to found Pennsylvania. John Locke wrote about liberty, and he distinguished theoretically two things that are the core, again, what Congress does today, and it goes back to the Constitution. What we now call human rights and civil rights, they're quite separate. What John Locke talked about was the role of the individual, the importance of the person, the importance of the people. And that was very different. Sovereignty, according to Locke's thinking, and his friend Algernon Sidney, was that sovereignty resided in the people, and it was the people who decided government. And Algernon Sidney was one of the people who put that together. So successful was he in arguing for democracy as a form of Puritan kernel that Charles II had him executed. And he became a leading thinker, and you don't read much of it in the workings, but he became a leading thinker for people like Thomas Jefferson. And it was Thomas Jefferson who took much of the writings of these early English thinkers and brought them in his work in the Declaration of Independence to the United States. And that's why the historical background is important, because the thinking in those days was the rule of law, the importance of the individual, and the separation of powers that allowed the people, through their representatives, through their parliament, to hold the executive, the president, to account. So those ideas crossed the Atlantic, became enshrined in the Constitution to a greater or lesser extent. Yes, the Constitution didn't really affect you that much if you were a woman, if you were a Catholic, if you were Jewish, certainly not if you were black. Indeed, it actually specified in minute detail how much an African American was worth less than an Anglo-American. So the Constitution was flawed from the beginning, but it also established the separation of powers and the idea that the representation of the people and the way in which the people can hold the powerful to account was the most important thing it did. And that's why Congress is so important, or why it's so powerful. So what do we mean then by effective? As a legislature, passing laws, does it make good laws? Well, all legislatures make good and bad laws. Matt referred to some very bad laws in his talk. And you must remember again that the United States is actually 50 states. It began as 13 colonies and then became 50 states over the course of the last 225 years. The last two states to actually join the United States were very recent. in the 1940s, Alaska and Hawaii. And before that you had territories for Arizona and New Mexico, and territories would gradually apply to become members of the United States. So each of these has its own legislature, each of these can pass its own law. Matt referred in his talk to capital punishment. Actually, there are all different kinds of capital punishment, and a lot of states don't have capital punishment, and those that do have capital punishment quite often don't implement it. So, if you are in Texas and you commit a capital offence, the chances are, at some stage, 20 years down the line, you will be executed. Also in Florida. But in other states, mainly in New England and Washington and Oregon, they don't have capital punishment. So this idea of a common law is actually a common law that is also divided 50 times. So it becomes very complex. In some parts of America, you can legally buy and smoke marijuana. In other parts, you'll go to jail for 5 years. In some parts of America, you used to be able to drive at 16. It's going up in some places now. In others, it was much older. In some states, you could drink at 17. Arizona, until 20 years ago, has now gone up. And in other states, you couldn't drink until 21. It was easier to get heroin in California than it was to get beer if you were 20 years old. Neither was legal, I might add, but one was more plentiful than the other. So, the Congress then, the role of the Congress, the role of the Parliament, is to represent, to hold to account, and also to educate. So, holding that in your mind, that's the context. When you're talking about, is Parliament effective, is Congress effective, is one more effective than the other, you've got to hold in your mind the historical content and the political context. Why are they doing it? Why have we set them up the way we have? If institutions didn't matter, we wouldn't invent them. And so that's why, when we look at what we've got there, we need to look at what was the original intention, what are they supposed to do they do more than one job? And when we ask, are they effective, do they do it well, then we need to ask, how are we going to judge them? Both the British and the US, Congress and Parliament, are bicameral. They have an upper and a lower house. Both do different things. In the US, both are elected. Both lower houses represent the people. Now the Senate, for reasons that Matt outlined in his talk, has 100 members, 2 for each state, no matter what its size. And that's interesting. So you've got California, with over 30 million people, that if it were an independent country, would be the, depending on how you count the GDP, would be the 5th or 6th most powerful nation on Earth. Just one part of California, the greater Los Angeles area, has a gross domestic product greater than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. Los Angeles city alone, well, the 80 cities that make up Los Angeles, has a GDP greater than Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. So we're looking at huge, organised political structures. So 30 point something million people, 2 senators. North Dakota, a few buffalo, a few Native American reservations, and under 250,000 voters, lots of prairie, lots of rattlesnakes, 2 senators. New York, nearly as big and as powerful as California, likes to think it's even better because it's older. Again, an economy that dwarfs many countries around the world. 2 senators. Montana, called the Big Sky Country, because that's all there is to look at. They legalised cannabis there first because they needed something to do. Under 300,000 people, just 1 member of Congress, same as North Dakota, same as South Dakota, 1 member of Congress each, 2 senators. And this reflects the historic compromise between geography, between all kinds of interests that are designed to actually prevent the power of the people doing what Thomas Jefferson did in that slide earlier, become a tyranny of the majority. Because if you have a representative democracy that says anything that the majority pass, 50% plus 1 vote, becomes a law, then you can do bad things. You can do all kinds of things that are seen as a tyranny of the majority. And so the Senate is a check on that popular vote. 435 members of the House of Representatives, and they have huge constituencies, 500, 600,000 people. They are the representatives, they are the ones that are the real democratic element, but they're held in check by the Senate. They're also held in check by the President. I'll come back to that in a minute. So this idea that America is the greatest democracy, yes, but it's a very complex democracy. This idea that Congress is very powerful, yes, but different bits of Congress do different things. One bit of it represents the 300 and something million people. The other bit represents something quite different. And it varies over time, what it does represent. Initially, the Senate wasn't even directly elected. It has been for many years now. So again, if you compare the US Congress with the British Parliament, you see, there we are, Britain with a population slightly in excess of 60 million, has 650 members of Parliament. The United States population of over 300 million has 435 members of Congress. So if they were really representative, would they not have more? If they were really effective in representing, would they not have more? I'll come back to that in a minute. The upper house in Britain is wholly appointed, slightly hereditary still, although most of the hereditaries are gone. But it also has bishops of the Church of England. So you've got bishops of the Church of England, the established church, 781 lords in total. Apart from a few who are hereditaries voted in by their party, the vast majority are people who are appointed by the Prime Minister. A lot of them are party hacks, people who have lost their seat in Parliament or have retired and are appointed to Parliament. Somebody who used to work here, and he won't mind me saying this because he's actually in print of saying it, was the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Ulster, Trevor Smith, now Lord Smith of Clifton of Mount Sandal, actually, who is in the House of Lords, describes it as the best daycare centre in London. The point being that most of them are quite elderly. There are very few under the age of 50, even fewer under the age of 40. But what are they there for? They don't actually know anymore. They're there in the old traditional way of being a revising chamber. But the whole idea of revising the upper house has moved away from what it used to be. And so is the British Parliament more effective than the American Congress? Well, they do different things. And actually, it's not very clear now what at least one part, and in sheer numbers terms, the largest part and the most undemocratic part of the British Parliament is actually for. I don't know the answer. I'm only an academic. I have no views of my own. These are just questions you can answer. So let's look again at the lower house then, the really effective bit, the powerful bit in both houses, the powerful bit that does the work, that raises the taxes. Both houses are dominated by political parties. They only function on a party system. They can only work effectively on a party system. Why is that? Well, that's how it's evolved. And the electoral system reflects that. So if you're looking at what is an effective party system, you also need to look at the rules. Look at how things are structured. Congress is only powerful because of the way it's been structured, the rules by which it runs. The Constitution, yes. The electoral system. The same with the British Parliament. If you had a system that gave absolute proportional representation, you'd have a plethora of political parties sitting in the National Parliament. If you copy some of the proportional representation systems that exist within the British Isles and much further afield, you'd have many more parties. And if you didn't put a threshold in that limited them beyond a certain level, you'd have parties at the very far left, the very far right, anti-democratic parties. And what you have with the first past the post system in both the United States and the United Kingdom is an electoral system that forces parties to the centre, forces them to compromise because they're the ones that get elected. If you look at the bell curve, most people are in the middle, they vote in the middle. The parties that are in the middle, in a first past the post system, are the ones that get elected. That then reflects the way in which the Parliament and the Congress function. It is an effective way to divide up the way they work by making it run along party lines. But we have to ask, is the two-party system breaking down? Certainly in the United Kingdom it's under strain. It's challenged by nationalists in other parts of the United Kingdom. It's challenged by UKIP It's challenged by the Greens, it's challenged by parts of the New Left, parts of the New Right. But still the two biggest parties retain control. In the United States, they had their first socialist member of Congress elected for Vermont recently. I don't know if you've ever been to Vermont. It's a beautiful place in the autumn. There's not much to do there. Watch the trees go brown, wait for the snow to clear, watch them go green again. But Burlington in Vermont elected its mayor as first socialist, and so you have a socialist in Congress. Bigger splash in the American papers, because firstly, this was the only person in Congress at that time, has various since, who wasn't a Republican or a Democrat. Because the Republicans and the Democrats have an arm lock on American politics. Why? Because the system forces it into a two-party system. But look even closer, they are coalitions of interest. A Democrat from California is very different to a Democrat from New England. It's very different to a Democrat from Florida. A Republican from the northeast, the New England area, very different to a Republican from Texas. And that, again, is key to understanding the role of Congress. The upper house in the US is more powerful than the upper house in Britain. It can begin the impeachment proceedings of a president. It can do all kinds of things that the House of Lords can't do. But in both houses, in Congress and in Parliament, it is the committee system that is dominant in terms of advancing legislation, of holding people to account through the Public Accounts Committee, the Public Administration Committee, and in the American equivalents of those, the Ways and Means, the things that actually decide what gets into law. All of these are dominated by the major party. So when you're looking at a system, which house is more powerful, which house is more effective, you're actually asking, really, how does the party system work? How do the procedures within, how do the rules by which things operate, how effectively are they carried out to allow business to be taken into account, to make into law statutes, to make into practice holding everybody to account. Only in Parliament and in Congress can the lower house levy taxes. The upper house can't do it. They can't introduce money bills, that is, bills that spend money. And in Congress, they won't levy taxes until they bring the President's Secretaries of State into Congress to answer questions. How did you spend that money? Did you spend it wisely? Has it been spent in a way that we agreed? The British Parliament doesn't quite do that because of the strength of the party system. But in the US system, Congress frequently changes budgets, frequently changes money bills, and it can spend money the President didn't want to spend and not spend money that he does want to spend. So Congress then is more powerful in the sense that it is more able to hold the executive to account, but it does that through a party system, through a committee system. But, and there's always a but, Congress is, yes, much more lavishly funded in terms of research and assistance, both to individuals, legislatures and to committees. So it has more knowledge. It is able to be more effective because it can do more. The structures, the separation of powers, whereby you can't simultaneously sit in the legislature and in the executive, means that it is a career in its own right. In the United Kingdom Parliament, every MP, or most MPs, want to be a minister. You don't get to be a minister if you upset the whips, if you upset the party. If you are a minister, you don't stay a minister if you don't do what the Prime Minister wants. So it's an executive-dominated system. Whereas in the United States, it is largely, not entirely, but largely a legislative-dominated system. That's how it was designed. And every so often, when the president becomes an imperial, whether it's F.D. Roosevelt or Nixon, or indeed to a certain extent, but not to the same extent, Reagan, Congress comes back and knocks them down. It comes back and reasserts itself. It may pass the War Powers Act. It passes all kinds of acts to prevent the president from using the kind of powers that they've been using to circumvent what Congress wants. So the separation of powers in the United States is one of the keys that makes that a more effective body, both in making legislation, but also in holding the executive to account. So Congress has no compunction in altering bills, has no compunction in not spending money or spending more money. As Matt said, one of the reasons why the United States spends so much money on defence is because of the lobby system that pushes American defence expenditure up. Quite the reverse of what is occurring in the United Kingdom. So which is effective then? It depends on what you want. Parliament, the British Parliament, is the only body that can remove the Prime Minister in an afternoon. And at Yalta, at the end of the Second World War, and again at Potsdam, when Winston Churchill met Roosevelt and Stalin, they were all talking about how to rebuild Europe, how to rebuild the world after the end of the Second World War. And Churchill said, only Britain is a true democracy, because only in Britain could I be sacked tomorrow morning. They can't get rid of either of you without a very difficult process. In Stalin's case, it was to induce a stroke and make sure he didn't get medical treatment. You can't get rid of a president very easily. There have only been 2 impeachments, and I don't think either were effective. Clinton was the last one to be impeached, and that wasn't effective. So what you have is a system whereby, yes, Congress is more powerful, but because of the separation of powers, its ultimate sanction, the removal from office of the head of government, it can't do very easily, or indeed very quickly. Whereas parliaments in Britain can turn in a day and remove a whole government through a motion of no confidence. Doesn't happen very often, but it does happen.